and welcome to In the Studio. I'm Redbeard, bringing you the stories behind the making of the greatest rock albums in history. Today, we'll go in the studio with the album that put Kansas on the musical map.
Kind of a magic feeling around the recording of Leftoverture that years later, as we recorded our subsequent albums, we kept saying, what was it we did that made this come out that way? And you know, I really think we went back to the same studio, we used the same place, the same people, and we weren't able to recapture that. So I attribute it to the songs.
Hi, this is Phil Ehart, and I'm Steve Walsh of Kansas, in the studio for Leftoverture.
In the early 1970s, the style of rock and roll, which came to be known as progressive rock, was played almost exclusively by English bands. British groups such as King Crimson, Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer began experimenting with complicated arrangements and sounds that sometimes had as much to do with classical music as they did with rock and roll. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that American bands began to successfully follow suit. And one of the most successful of the American progressive rock bands was Kansas. Leftoverture, the band's fourth album, was released in October 1976 and would go on to sell more than 3 million copies. It went to number 5 in the album charts and contained their first big hit, Carry On, Wayward Son. The critics, however, were never kind to Kansas. Kerry Livgren, who was the band's lead guitarist and chief songwriter for the Leftoverture album, thinks it was because the critics simply couldn't accept the idea of a progressive rock band coming from Topeka, Kansas.
The fact I think that we were an American band that in a lot of ways emulated the progressive rock from England was something that really bugged a lot of American critics. You know, they tend to love the American favorite bands, and you know, personally, I didn't care where somebody came from. If I liked their music, I liked their music, and what influenced me. And we were as from Kansas and the Midwest as you can get. But they thought, well, you shouldn't sound like that if you come from Kansas. So they didn't like that, and apparently people didn't seem to care because they sold millions of records anyway.
To Kerry Livgren, the Kansas lineup that recorded Leftoverture was lead singer Steve Walsh, drummer Phil Ehart, bass player Dave Hope, guitarist Rich Williams, and violinist Robbie Steinhardt, whose father was a musicologist at Kansas University, specializing in the study of music from the Renaissance period. Here's the band's co-founder, Phil Ehart.
Well, from the beginning, Kansas was just and always has been basically, a bar band. People always say, well, you know, what's your background and what musical school did you go to and stuff? I mean, we were self-taught guys who grew up playing bars, high schools, rodeos, you name it, we played it. Robbie did have some classical background, his father being a classical violinist and stuff, and I think you have to be classically trained to play a violin. But most of us were just rock musicians. And what it was meant to be from the get-go, that's a real good question, because we didn't know. I mean, we didn't consciously sit down and go, well, you know, guys, let's be real interesting this way, and let's be real. It was just like, anybody got a song? Yeah, I wrote a song. Okay, well, let's do it, you know. And it was just like, but it was these 6 guys. We were all poor as church mice. I mean, nobody had a nickel to their name. And we all lived in a band house, and, you know, every penny we made went to keeping the bus running, the school bus that we had, going into the PA system, and keeping Dave, our bass player, in cigarettes. So, I mean, it was basically, that was what the gigs entailed. And I'm sure every band has the stories of starting out and starving and stuff, but that's the way we were. And but we never quite fit into this mold. You know, we were always a little bit kind of out in left field.
Kansas started, as so many bands do, through high school friendships. In this case, West Topeka High School. Here's Phil Ehart.
Topeka, Kansas is where it started. 4 of us went to high school together. It was that simple, and had grown up together. And Steve was from a neighboring town of St. Joe, Missouri, and Robbie was from a neighboring town of Lawrence, Kansas. So we were all within a 80-mile radius, and we were all in different bands, and we were all always pretty much rival bands, and Steve's band would come to town, or we'd go up in that area and we'd run into each other. But as we got older, you know, as other people would get jobs and drop out of bands, the guys that were the lifers, that I called it, you know, the guys that were in it for the duration, the numbers got smaller and smaller, and you knew that who you wanted to play with and who you didn't want to play with.
Kerry Livgren.
They actually used to call Topeka, Kansas, in the early 60s, they called it the Little Liverpool. The reason was there were so many garage bands in our school. I almost can't think of anybody in my high school class that wasn't in some kind of a band, either as a player or a roadie or something. I mean, it was just like this incredible fad to be in a band. And so just about everybody was some kind of a musician. And there was only one gig for every 30 bands, in the bars and high schools and stuff. So most of them played in garages.
Kerry Livgren has said that Topeka was a place with no real musical tradition of its own. So when the members of Kansas were growing up in the 60s, they were particularly receptive to music from other places.
Well, we were totally receptive to outside influences. People say the world is a global village. Well, that's absolutely true. Topeka, Kansas, because it's in the middle of wheat farmers in the Midwest, doesn't mean we're not exposed to every kind of music that... you can get any kind of music anywhere in the country. You could live in Cody, Wyoming, and go in a record store and buy the same things you buy in New York City. Maybe not quite the variety, but nevertheless, we were exposed to all different kinds of music. And people assumed that because we were from Kansas, that we should be a fiddle band, or I don't know what they thought we should have sounded like. But we were a product, and all artists are a product to one degree or another, or what they listen to at an early stage and what they're exposed to. We heard all kinds of British rock, everything from Cream to King Crimson, and we incorporated that in our music, and we heard ZZ Top and incorporated that in our music, and we were a little of all those things, and that's true of anybody. The one thing that was, I think, important was that we didn't really try to duplicate them. We emulated all those things. We put all those things in a big blender and turned it on high speed. Above all, we wanted to be original. We really wanted to have our own sound, which I think we did.
Phil Ehart.
We were a terrible copy band when we played clubs. We couldn't imitate anybody. I mean, the closest we probably came was to Grand Funk Railroad, because Steve could sound somewhat like Mark Farner, But even that, how do you do that with 6 guys and a violin? I mean, that didn't come off real good either, We couldn't do anybody. Basically, what we'd do is we'd get up and we'd announce a song that we had written, but we didn't tell them we wrote it. We'd announce it as a new Emerson, Lake and Palmer song, and then we'd play our song. And that way the club owners and the people out front were just saying, oh, yeah, they're doing ELP. Oh, they're doing Yes. And that's weird. I haven't heard that Yes song, but it sure is good. Well, it was our stuff. And that's how we got away with doing club gigs and existing, because we could not. We were so stylized with this violin and with Robbie and with Stevens, we couldn't copy anybody else. We were just us.
The band that the world came to know as Kansas actually grew out of 2 Topeka groups. One, formed by Phil Ehart, was called White Clover. The other, formed by Livgren, had also been called Kansas. In 1972, the bands joined forces under one name, forming what Livgren called a sort of local supergroup. By 1973, Kansas was in search of a record deal. Phil Ehart remembers how they got it.
But we had heard from a friend of ours in New York City that Don Kirshner, of rock concert fame, wanted to start his own label. So we sent a tape up to this engineer friend, who I, to this day, still can't remember who the guy was. But he took the tape over, and he called me and he said, Phil, I just put it on Don Kirshner's desk, on the receptionist's desk, and there was already 80 tapes in. So yours was the 81st. So I said, well, forget about that. We'll never hear about that. And, we sent out a few of the tapes and got rejected, and so we started gigging, and we were at a gig in Dodge City, Kansas, where we played every once in a while, and you could imagine the bar we were playing in Dodge City, Kansas. This waitress comes up and goes, which one of you guys is Phil Ehart? And I said, well, that's me. And she goes, well, there's a long-distance phone call for you. And I said, okay. So I got behind the bar. And he goes, Phil, this is Wally Gold. I'm Don Kirshner's right-hand man, and I'm calling to say hi and say that we got your tape, and we're very interested in hearing your band. Well, my first inclination is somebody's pulling a major joke, but it really was Wally Gold. He wanted to come out and hear us, so we scrambled to try to find a place in Kansas where because this was our only chance. I mean, this was our only shot, and it turned out to be the only shot we ever got. So we didn't want to blow this. So we found this hall in Ellenwood, Kansas, which probably held 1,500 people. And for 2 weeks prior, we advertised everywhere that it was going to be free beer. Come and drink all the free beer you can pour in your face, because we wanted this place packed when this guy shows up, so he thinks we're the frickin' Beatles, as far as he's concerned. So he lands. He takes a private plane down from New York City. He lands. I mean, we spent, every penny we had, which was minimal to buy kegs and kegs of free beer. So, so we pull up to the and there's people wrapped around the hall. I mean, you could imagine every cowboy and redneck in Kansas, farmer and stuff was there because they had heard free. They didn't know who Kansas was. They didn't care. They wanted the free beer. Well, the guy from New York didn't know that. He saw this crowd and he thought, these guys must be incredible, you know. So it goes, everybody's plowed out of their brain. He got hit in the back of the head with a beer bottle. I mean, it didn't hurt him, but, you know, someone went on and hit him. People spilled beer on him. But he was in heaven. I mean, he thought, this is the most incredible band I've ever seen, because no matter what we played, the people went crazy because they were so plowed. You know, he went back to Don Kirshner and said, yeah, I've seen these guys. They're incredible. The crowds that they draw are, you know, just in thousands, you know. And so, yeah, it was quite a ridiculous story.
On My Mind, written by Kerry Livgren, each verse about a different person. Next, we'll find out about the last-minute recording of Carry On, Wayward Son. I'm Redbeard, and you're in the studio for Kansas Leftoverture.
I'm Phil Ehart of Kansas, in the studio for Leftoverture.
And I'm Redbeard. Kansas released its debut album in March 1974, following that with Song for America in February 1975, and Mask in November of the same year. Now that's working. And in the midst of that, the band was touring constantly, doing more than 250 shows a year. The only break in touring came when it was time to rehearse and record another album. Here's Phil Ehart.
When we did go do Leftoverture, we had practiced up in Topeka, getting ready to go to Bogalusa to record, Bogalusa, Louisiana. Carrie walks in on the last day. I mean, I'm breaking down my drums, packing them up, and Carrie goes, I've written one more song for the album. I don't know if you guys are interested in doing it, but I'd like to at least try. Once we get down, we don't have time to rehearse it here, but let's rehearse it when we get to Bogalusa. And I said, well, okay, does it have a name? And he said, yeah, it's called Carry On, Wayward Son.
Carry on, my wayward Livgren.
We were completely done with this record. We were finished with Leftoverture. We were working on tightening up the songs because we were going to leave in a couple of days to go to the studio. And I was sitting at home. My dad had bought me a piano at a garage sale, and I was living in my parents' basement because we were so poor we had nowhere else to live at the time. My dad bought me this old piano, and it was down in the basement. And I sat down there and I started playing the song. I thought, man, this is kind of neat, you know. And I kept working on it, and it turned into Wayward Son. And I came in the last day of the rehearsal. And I thought, the guys are going to hate me. But I said, guys, I got one more song, and I think we ought to listen. And so I played it for them, and everybody's kind of looking at each other. Yeah, this is maybe happening, and we didn't even have time to learn the song. So we went down to Bogalusa, Louisiana, where we recorded, and somewhere along the line we made the decision, we pulled something else off the album and put this song on. And we literally learned Carry On Wayward Son almost as we were recording it. And once we stood back and listened to it, we began to realize this song was, you know, moved not only onto the album, but to the front. It was like the opening cut, and it turned out to be our first hit. So it was kind of a good thing I brought it up at the last moment.
Steve Walsh.
One thing that was about Wayward Son is we all liked it. We all liked the song and gravitated toward it. So that the concept of writing a hit single or coming up with a hit single, we had been beaten up over the head for the past 3 albums. You guys have got to come up with a hit single, and so the next album had come along, and now you've really got to come up with a hit single. Well, this album, Leftoverture, we all liked the song, so we dismissed it. We didn't think it had a chance in hell because we liked it so much that too much to be a hit single. Little did we know.
Leftoverture was recorded in Bogalusa, Louisiana at a place called The Studio in the Country, where Kansas had also recorded the Mask album. As Kerry Livgren recalls, to say it was in the country was being kind.
In the middle of a swamp. It was literally in the middle of a swamp. You could walk out of the studio and there were gators, you know, mosquitoes the size of B-52s and stuff. It was really an unusual experience. We used to have armadillos walk into the control room and stuff. It was an interesting place to record. It was a great place to record in a way. We were isolated and we were there to work. And that's what we did.
Before going to Bogalusa, the band had rehearsed back home in Topeka. Although calling the sessions rehearsals is something of an understatement, they were in fact frantic, pressurized sessions where the band members had to write and arrange new material under incredibly strict deadlines. The bulk of the songwriting burden fell on the shoulders of Kerry Livgren.
When it came time to do Leftoverture, we had no songs, and so we would go to the rehearsal hall, and we would have like a rehearsal the next day. That night I had to write a song. So I'd write a song, come in a rehearsal the next day, would learn it. Okay, we had to have one for the next day, so I had to go home that night, write a song, come back the next day. And so these things were just cranked out. It was an incredible flurry of creativity for me, and a lot of it was high pressure. It was an environment that I didn't really enjoy. I didn't like writing with a gun to my head on a schedule like that. But I'd have to say, looking back at it, it was one of my high points because I had a lot of inspiration happening, and I had a lot of ideas. It made it tougher because at that point in time, for some reason, Steve just dried up as a writer. Didn't have anything. I would come in a rehearsal, and it was like, well, Kerry, have you got anything? Yeah, I got one. Next day, I thought, God, come on, Steve, bring something in here, man. I can't take this. And I'd come in the next day, and Steve wouldn't have anything. So, well, okay, I got a song. And I actually remember sitting there in that rehearsal hall when we were working on Leftoverture. And while one guy, I was teaching one guy a part to a song, I'd go over to my keyboard and start playing something off what I had to have for tomorrow, So it was a tough time, but it was some of the best songs I ever came up with.
Even now, Phil Ehart and Steve Walsh are amazed at the music Livgren came up with under those conditions. Of the 8 songs on Leftoverture, Livgren wrote 5 of them on his own and co-wrote the other 3. Phil Ehart remembers.
Well, at this time, Kerry's at full gallop. Okay? Kerry wrote the majority of Leftoverture. The band is probably at its tightest, one of its tightest. The band is really a band. Kerry was the musical leader, but there was no leader in Kansas at the time. We had 6 guys, and there were 6 leaders, and it was very tough to work with because you had nobody really guiding where the band was going. It was just like everybody just kind of went along, Luckily, we had such one vision together that's where we all wanted to go. That in later times really caused a lot of problems. But at this time, Kerry is eating, breathing, and sleeping Kansas. Okay? I mean, it's coming out of every pore in his body.
And Steve Walsh.
At this particular time, it was Kerry's vision. We interpreted it, and in doing that, little by little, would definitely add things to the music. Some he liked, some he didn't. But I would definitely say that, yeah, this was not only his vision from song to song, but his vision as an album, I think.
Kerry had a lot of pressure put on him because he and Steve had written together on all the previous albums, the 3 previous albums. This particular album, Steve had hit some sort of a writer's block. I don't care who the other writer was, whether it was Steve or who. I don't think anybody could have topped what Kerry was coming up with. I mean, Steve was coming up with stuff, but he'd come up with a song the same day Kerry walked in with Miracles Out of Nowhere. Well, Steve kind of goes, well, sheesh, I guess back to the drawing board. Well, Steve comes in the next day, Kerry says, well, I got Cheyenne Anthem. Steve kind of goes, well, I don't think I'll show you this song today that I've got. Steve was writing, but Kerry was way up here, and Steve was, Kerry was just on a roll. Everybody that was there at the time just said, God, this guy is coming up with such incredible stuff that there was no stopping him.
Yeah, and I didn't want there to be either. At the time, I can remember really looking forward to him bringing in stuff like this. At this particular time, it was wonderful to be a part of things like Cheyenne Anthem.
It was really just kind of stand back and watch.
Oh, yeah.
It was like just kind of like, what's he going to bring in today? And as soon as he started playing it, we just look at each other and just go, God, this is incredible. It was like such a quantum leap from Mask, which had some good stuff on it. But Kerry, this stuff was a cut above. The guy was definitely on his way up as a major songwriting force in rock and roll. And we were just happy to be there.
Questions of My Childhood, written by Kerry Livgren and Steve Walsh. When we come back, we'll hear how life changed for Kansas when they found success. I'm Redbeard, and you are in the studio for Leftoverture.
I'm Steve Walsh of Kansas in the studio for Leftoverture.
And I'm Redbeard. In addition to their ornate instrumental structures, many of the Kansas songs, particularly the ones written by Kerry Livgren, dealt with spiritual themes, the question of man's place in the universe. A good example is Livgren's song, The Wall.
The Wall was a intensely personal song for me. I remember when I wrote that song, my parents would go to work during the day, and I'd go out of my basement where the piano was, upstairs where my dad had a Lowry organ that had this one setting that sounded like a big pipe organ or something, and the sound of that organ caused me to write in a little different vein than I might have with a guitar or a piano. But The Wall, lyrically, I guess represented, maybe better than any song I've ever written at that point in time, my personal spiritual longing to really find an answer to life and who we are and why we're here and all that kind of stuff. And I felt like at that time I was just up against this invisible, impenetrable wall that wouldn't let me get any further or wouldn't let me get any closer to that. And it was a very intense, almost Wagnerian kind of a scenario with that song, and it would have lent itself well to that kind of a music. So the marriage of the music and the lyrics on that song, I think, really, really worked well. I think I put up the wall looking back on it. I was a very philosophical, mystical, religious pilgrim. I guess would be the best way to describe myself. And I went through a period in my life where I was just, the guys used to say I was the charter member of the Religion of the Month Club. I would just go from one thing to another. And in 1979, I became a Christian, and at that point, I consider that wall to have tumbled down and found everything that I was looking for.
After recording Leftoverture, Kansas started touring again almost immediately. Until Carry On Wayward Son became a hit, touring was the only way for the band to gain a following. So they spent years in rented cars and second-hand vans. The nightmare life of an opening act. Phil Ehart.
It was a touring blur. I mean, we literally were on the road for 11 months. And when I mean on the road, I mean gone on the road. We'd come back, we wrote a lot of stuff on the road. We'd go in and rehearse and go right down and record. So, I mean, we just went in and did it. Everything was first or second takes, just get it down. And then, boom, right back on the road again. Because as an opening band, we made $750 a night. And the more we toured, the more we went in debt. And by the time Leftoverture hit, Carry On Wayward Son hit, we were approximately $175,000 in debt. Because it cost us more to get to the gig to open for Mott the Hoople or to open for the Kinks or to open for Bad Company or Queen or whatever. It cost us more to get there than we were paid. So we were constantly in debt. So it's a good thing that we did have a hit, or we would have all been in debtor's prison of some sort.
The band, in fact, was so busy touring, they didn't even know Carry On Wayward Son had become a hit. They didn't even know how close they were to being a headlining act with a triple platinum album. Steve Walsh remembers the first clue that something had changed.
I can still remember the people that handled all the accounting and everything. I called them because at the time I think we were, right before Wayward Son hit. We were all on, some kind of salary from the band. And we all got like $75 or $100 a week. And then I started to hear Wayward Son on the radio and understand that we were a bit more successful. I had no idea how well it was doing. And I remember calling them one day and saying, is there any way that we can get maybe $150 a week, instead of $100 or $125? And they said, well, you can have a lot more than that if you want. And I said, what? This was so, oh boy, I mean, it was a wonderful feeling. I'll never forget that as long as I live. It was a great phone call.
Eventually, Kansas would find that success had its drawbacks, that the pressure to repeat was sometimes the toughest pressure of all. By 1983, the old Topeka Friends had splintered apart amidst lawsuits and bad feelings. Happily, however, the wounds have healed. Ehart and Walsh have formed a new version of Kansas with Richard Williams, and Livgren is pursuing a solo career. He has fond memories.
One thing about Kansas, we always looked at an album as an absolute total package. I mean, we didn't just make music and then hand it over to somebody else and be done with it. We were totally personally involved with our album covers, with everything that was all the text that was on the album covers, everything that was said, the comments, the liner notes, both sides of the cover, the inner sleeve. We were always in on the design of that. the sequencing of the songs, everything about the album we saw as a thing that ultimately we wanted to be responsible for. And that was just one case where it all really worked. It all fell into place. There was kind of a magic feeling around the recording of Leftoverture that years later, as we recorded our subsequent albums, we kept seeing, what was it we did that made this come out that way? And, I really think we went back to the same studio, we used the same place, the same people, and we weren't able to recapture that. So I attribute it to the songs. The songs themselves were structured in a way that allowed the instruments to sound good. It was a good lesson in production, really. I think it was kind of accidental. It wasn't something that we knew to do beforehand. It was just kind of the way they turned out. And Miracles Out of Nowhere was a song that was wide open for everything to sound good in. It was a song that allowed for a lot of different musical textures within the framework of the same song, and it just really worked.
This is Redbeard, and I'd like to thank Kerry Livgren, Phil Ehart, and Steve Walsh for recalling the time when they were truly miracles out of nowhere. And special thanks go to Bud Carr.